She didn't cry, and no one asked her name. 6 children had been left in the dust of the marketplace, like things no one cared to keep. People looked, then turned away. Only one man rose earlier than dawn, lit a fire without needing a reason. A loaf of bread was left at the door of an old storage shed. No note, no name. From that small act, a story began, not in blood, but in the quiet way someone chose not to turn their back. Part 1. A name no one spoke. The August wind blew as if it wanted to leave this land behind. Red dust curled under wooden wagon wheels, trailing in a blurred streak of sunlight across fields burned bare. The wagon lurched, groaning each time it struck a hollow in the earth, dry, sharp sounds like teeth grinding. On it sat a woman who did not look back. Her collar was patched over patches, one shoulder marked by a crusted milk stain, white as salt. Her hands gripped the reins the way someone might grip the right to forget. Behind her, 6 children stood, not in rows, not even straight, just standing, like 6 shadows not yet fully formed. The oldest girl, thin and sun-darkened like a half-burned stick, held the youngest in her arms, her bare feet planted in the dirt like the roots of some wild thing. She didn't follow the wagon with her eyes, nor glance around. She only kept her hold on the trembling weight in her arms, steady enough so it would not slip away. No call went after the wagon. No voice cried, "Mama!" No one ran. The dust caught in the hem of her skirt, coiled around her thin ankles, then drew back as if to erase all trace of whoever had just left. No one asked where they came from. No one asked their names. A man passed, leading a limping mule, touched the brim of his hat in passing and moved on. A woman glanced over, her eyes not unkind, but not enough to stop. She shook her head faintly, as if she'd seen this too many times to count. By noon, the sun cast their shadows like burn marks spreading across the ground. The girl's shadow stretched the longest, but it was the thinnest. Her name was Marin. Or it had been. She had once been called that, but never in gentleness. Her name was spoken only when blame needed a place to land, when trouble needed a bearer, or when someone wanted to hang responsibility on a neck that wasn't theirs. The Marin of before had known how to run, had known how to take her mother's hand, had dared to say, "I'll look after them," but each time it had earned her a weary glare, a sigh, or the sting of a slap that made her feel foolish for thinking she belonged anywhere. Bit by bit, the name became something she hid, like a debt, a snare, a memory traded away for a pack of tobacco and a handful of coins. The child in her arms made a sound, a faint hitch like wind slipping through a hole in the roof. She pulled the cloth higher over its head. Her hands weren't clean, but they were warm. She didn't know where she was taking Jim them. But if they stayed here, the wind would claim the smallest first, then the next. Behind her, 5 smaller faces drooped, not from hunger, not yet, but from being too used to going unnoticed. Once, when they still had both parents, they had lived in a house with a slanted roof. Their father used to sit in the yard. Their mother cooked thin soup. But when debt came, one thing after another was sold. Chairs, the bed frame, then even their names. "These girls are nothing but mouths to feed," someone had once said, in plain hearing. The last time Marin had heard her name, spoken without anger, had been in her grandmother's voice, on a morning long past as she combed Marin's hair, and murmured, "Marin, lift your chin, child." It had not been spoken like that since. On the red dust roads of America that year, there was no shortage of those left behind, no shortage of wagons that carried away only half their blood kin. But there were few who stayed, and fewer still who could keep their gaze level. Marin lowered her head, adjusted the wrap around the baby. She promised nothing. She knew that a broken promise could be crueler than silence. When the wind drove hard into her chest, she hunched forward, sheltering the baby like a thin wall stubborn enough to stand. She was not a mother, not a perfect sister, not a hero, just the last one who hadn't walked away. And so, in the high noon of a western town, with no farewells, no hawkers, no one waiting, Maren began a life with no name, no place, and no right to ask for anything. Only 6 pairs of feet, one faltering, one muddied, one unyielding, and a glance from a passerby that did not turn back. Part 2, The Shelter for Strangers. Shelter's Hollow lay swallowed between 2 larger towns. Like the shadow between 2 stories no one cared to tell in full. It had no theater, no bank, just an old well, a leaking storage barn, and a lodging house where travelers stayed only if their horses could go no farther. No one chose to remain there, unless they had nowhere else to go. Maren found the empty space beside the abandoned hay shed on the second afternoon, after a fine dusting of rain, the kind that made you just wet enough to feel weary, but not enough to feel clean. She spread a torn burlap sack on the ground, laid the youngest upon it, and told the other 4 to lean against the rotting wall. She sat at the outer edge, her back taking the wind. That first night the wind came through the gaps in the roof and cut straight at her neck. She did not sleep. Not from fear, but because if she slept, who would stir when a rat ran across her sister's face? At first light she walked to the well. The rope was rusted, the water carried the scent of earth and iron, but it was cold and real. She hauled 2 small pails back, washed her face behind the shed, combed her siblings' hair with her fingers, unseen. Then she drifted to the inn's doorway, lingering as though about to speak, then thinking better of it. The innkeeper glanced up, then back down to scrub the counter. He neither sent her away nor invited her in. She understood. By the 3rd day, Maren began to walk the town. She gathered fallen husks of corn, gleaned the small, knobby potatoes thrown out behind the market, salvaged lengths of baling twine, asked for scraps of clean cloth. No one asked where she had come from. No one asked where she meant to go. Only an old woman tossed a few onions from her porch without looking or speaking, then shut the door. Maren took both the skins and the bulbs. At midday the wind smelled of damp hay and the stale sweat of the horses at the tack change station. Her siblings dozed in the shade of an abandoned rail car. She poured water from a tin lid into their mouths, one by one. They did not say they were hungry, but she knew the curve of a back that couldn't stay upright anymore. From her cloth pouch, she pulled a hard piece of bread from yesterday, breaking it into crumbs, not out of stinginess, but to make the children believe there would still be more if they ate slowly. By the 5th day, people began to notice the thin girl passing the same street at the same hour when the sunlight angled low. They called her the shed girl, the sister of 6, the one who fetches water, the silent one. None of those were her name, but none were cruel. Maren gave no reply. She just kept moving, sweeping a step, hauling water, returning a lost handkerchief, as if each act was a debt being quietly repaid, though no one had asked it of her. One evening, when the air turned sharper, she sat folding scraps of cloth on the shed porch. Her hands were cracked at the knuckles. The baby in her lap slept. Her legs had gone numb, but her eyes stayed open, as though letting them close, even for a moment, might see all 6 children slip into the dust. Far off, a fire crackled in the only house with light at the end of the street. Smoke drifted past the crescent moon, thin as breath, after a day without anyone speaking your name. Maren looked toward that glow without expectation. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, a person needed only to look at something warm, even from far away. Shelter's Hollow did not know who she was. The town would never write her name in a ledger, never hang a board in thanks. but in a shadowed corner of the hayshed, there was always an old spoon laid neatly on a strip of cloth, and if one looked close, they'd see it was always clean, as if waiting for someone who, one day, might be called by their right name again. Part 3. A handkerchief left behind. That morning, the chill came earlier than usual. The wind wasn't strong enough to peel the tin from a roof, but it could tip a bucket if no one held it down. Maren woke before the rooster's call from the farm at the top of the hill. She eased herself out from under the burlap, moving slowly so as not to wake, the child whose face was pressed into the crook of her arm. She didn't want to be seen before the sun came up, not from fear, but because something in her refused to let another person's eyes fall on her hunger, her makeshift shelter, or the hair matted with 3 days' sweat and no soap. On the shed step, something was different. A round loaf of bread sat in a coarse cloth sack, whole, uncrushed, not the kind tossed out behind the market. A light dusting of unbrowned flour still clung to its crust, fresh, warm, likely baked just the night before. Maren glanced around. No one, no footprints, no voice calling out. She didn't touch it right away. She stood there so long the steam stopped rising from the loaf. Then, without a word, she picked it up, took it inside, and tore it into small pieces. One for each of her siblings, none for herself. No one asked where it had come from, perhaps because, in their little band of 6, none of them felt they had the right to ask. The next morning another small sack appeared in the same spot. Dried beans, cleaned, sorted, carefully wrapped. Inside a layer of dry leaves, the kind someone uses when they mean to protect what's inside. Maren lifted it, silent. Her eyes blinked more than usual, as if something in them stung. She didn't cook them all at once. Half would be boiled for her siblings. The rest she would save, because no one had promised there would be a next time. On the 3rd day she found a handkerchief, clean, folded, faintly scented with old soap, placed neatly at the edge of the step beside the wooden basin she used to wash shirts. She stood looking at it for a long while. Thin cotton, pale gray trim. Not the cheap kind. In one corner, a single embroidered letter worn from years. R. No one gave away a handkerchief. No one in Shelter's Hollow had so many they could leave one for a stranger, and no one stitched initials into something they meant to part with. Maren stayed still. She didn't pick it up. She fetched water, rinsed rice, scrubbed cloth, just as she did every day. Only in the evening, when the sun had slipped behind the roof of the horse change station, did she return. The handkerchief was still there. This time she lifted it and folded it again, almost as if she were sending the care back toward whoever had placed it there. That night she used it to wipe the youngest child's face after supper. It was soft. It absorbed well. The little ones smiled, tilting their head back, as if it was the first time their skin had been touched by something that didn't scrape. Maren sat a while, looking at her own hand, holding the cloth. A hand rough and thin, calloused, yet for the first time holding something not for survival but for kindness. She told no one. She didn't tell her siblings, didn't urge them to remember. She didn't watch the road for whoever had left the bread. Only one small thing changed. The next morning, when she folded the cloth she slept on, she squared it more neatly. She spent longer combing her little sister's hair, and on the step she set a sprig of dried lavender. Her quiet reply: no name, no thanks, just enough so that if someone was watching, they would know I received it, and I will keep it safe. In a town people only passed through, there was a girl who dared not speak her name. Someone left her a handkerchief. And from then on, each morning she wiped her siblings' faces with a gentler hand. No one saw it, no one applauded. But from that act, something shifted. Maren began to feel she might be worthy of being called by a name, even if no one had yet spoken it aloud. Or Part 4. The Man Who Said Nothing. Every Western town has a man who lives alone, speaks little, laughs less, endures like the old fence post still standing after storms. In Shelter's Hollow, that man was Reuben Tallet. They said he'd lost his wife 10 winters back. Had no children, no kin who remembered the way to his door. He didn't haunt the saloon, didn't play cards, didn't go to church, but if a fence broke, he might mend it before dawn. If a neighbor's child coughed for a week, a bundle of dried herbs might be hanging on their door by morning. He never claimed the work. The townsfolk didn't call him a good man. They only said, "Reuben doesn't trouble anyone and doesn't need anyone." That was all. Maren first saw him as a shadow. Early morning, as always, she was at the well. The bucket was heavy, her hands shook. Her older sister stood behind her, hugging a small water jug, eyes red from the cold. When the rope was about to fray, someone stepped up from behind. No greeting, no interruption, just a sun-darkened hand closing over the rope, hauling the bucket with her. Steady, even, not taking over. When the water brimmed, he set the bucket in her hands, nodded once and walked away, as if he had only helped the bucket, not the girl. Maren said nothing. She only watched the worn back of his shirt fade toward the house at the top of the slope, the one with smoke rising at the same hour every morning. After that she began to notice firewood stacked neatly against the shed wall, not scattered like the wind-fallen branches beyond the ridge. Each bundle enough for one day's burning. Dry, evenly split. No rotted pieces, she couldn't be sure it was him. But each morning she'd straighten the pile a little more, as if answering the gesture. No words, no need for faces, just this. The one who lit the fire would see the one who left the wood. And the other way around. One afternoon, sweeping the ground before the shed, Maren spotted an old nail driven into the wall. Above it, a branch of dried laurel, bound with a length of twine. Not decoration, not fragrant, but tied with a sure hand. People often hung laurel as a sign. Someone lives here, not for show, but so nature or the world wouldn't forget someone's quiet claim to a place. She didn't take it down. She stepped back a few paces and gave a small nod, as if to thank the message. She didn't know who it was meant for, but she gave it anyway. One evening, while she stirred a pot of bean porridge, the youngest sniffled and pointed toward the fence. A shadow had passed by, not close enough to be spying, not far enough to be chance. Maren stepped outside. No one was there, only the wind and a small knife wedged into a block of wood, its handle turned toward her. The grip was wrapped in the same kind of twine that bound the laurel branch. It hadn't been misplaced. It hadn't been dropped. She pulled it free. It fit her, hand sharp, clean, rust-free, no note, no mark. But from then on she used that knife for everything. Paring turnips, cutting cloth, splitting kindling. And she always cleaned it before putting it away. Reuben never asked her name, never called to her, never tried to know her. But each time the season shifted, the wood was split finer, the sack of rice in the shed gained a handful of peanuts, and the chipped water ladle was replaced by a smooth new cup, set exactly where the old one had been. Maren never spoke of it. She wasn't sure anyone would believe her. She didn't need to explain. Only one thing was certain. Someone, without asking her name, was still making sure she didn't drift away. Not with words, but by leaving the right thing in the right place at the right time and walking off as though he'd never been there at all. Part 5. taking the cold for a child. The north slope wind came in on the 9th night, cold enough not to freeze solid, but sharp enough to split skin at the nails if you weren't wrapped in something. It slipped through the gaps in the shed roof, driving into Marin's back like pins. She didn't sleep, not out of watchfulness, but because the youngest of the 6, little Ivy, lay shivering in her lap, breath breaking as if the cold itself were pressing the air out of her. Marin put a hand to her forehead, hot. Not because the blanket was too thin, but because the fever had been rising since morning. By midday, her lips had turned pale violet. By evening, her crying had dwindled to small, ragged sobs. Now her eyes were half closed, the sockets drawn in. Marin trembled, not from the cold, but because she had once watched a child die from fever, simply because the night had turned colder and no one had noticed. No one. She lifted Ivy. Her hands weren't warm enough. Sweat from the chill dampened her back, but she wrapped the old cloth around them both. Marin didn't know how to pray. She'd never been taught. But she whispered into the child's ear, "Sleep. I'm here." Ivy didn't answer, only breathed in weak, uneven sighs like embers fading inside a stove. Close to midnight, Marin glanced toward the house at the top of the slope. The firelight still flickered in its kitchen window, same time as every night. Not to welcome anyone home, but because perhaps Reuben Tallet was the kind of man who lit fires without needing a reason. She had no plan to go there. She wasn't going to ask. She didn't expect help. But Ivy began to twitch in small fits, her tiny body like a wilted leaf whipped by the wind. For the first time, Marin felt afraid, not of being turned away, not of being told to leave, but afraid that if she did nothing, the one small voice still calling her with gentleness might never wake again come morning. She stood, her legs unsteady, but her steps even. The wind clawed her face, tore at the hem of her thin dress, but she held her sister tight, tucking Ivy's face into her collar. The hill was short, yet felt as long as a whole winter. Reuben's door opened before she could knock. No questions, no searching look, only as if he had seen her shadow from the window and had already set a thick blanket on the chair nearest the stove, waiting for someone no one had called. Marin stepped inside. The fire crackled, pine wood scent, the floorboards murmured under her feet, as if even they knew how to keep from breaking the silence. Reuben said nothing. He didn't tell her to sit. He simply pulled up another chair, fed the fire, and poured hot water into a clay mug mended with a faint crack. Marin wrapped Ivy in the blanket, set her close to the stove, and sat a small distance away, far enough not to intrude, close enough to know she was allowed to stay. She sat like that, silent for 3 nights. She didn't sleep, didn't beg, didn't tell her troubles. Reuben didn't speak, but each morning there was a wooden spoon beside a bowl of porridge, and each evening another stick of firewood appeared at her feet, dry, easy to burn, enough to last the night. On the 4th morning, Ivy opened her eyes. Her mouth moved, whispering a faint "sis." Just one word, but Marin bent her head for a long time, as if steadying a brimming cup she couldn't let spill. Reuben said nothing, but for the first time he set a 7th spoon on the table, perfectly placed, spaced just so, as if it had always belonged to someone who'd never had a name. Marin stared at it for a long time, afraid to touch it, because when someone set a place for you, without asking, without requiring, you began to believe you had the right to remain. And that night, for the first time in years, she slept. Not the heavy sleep of exhaustion, nor the dead drop of weariness, but the kind of sleep you fall into when you know someone else is keeping the fire. Part 6. One small thing a day. Marin left Reuben's house on the 4th morning. as the sun's edge lifted over the hills behind the town. In her arms was Ivy, fever gone, eyes still clouded but open again. The other children waited at the old shed, not knowing where she'd gone the night before and not asking. They were used to living without expecting anyone to return. That day, as always, Maren hauled water from the well, lit the fire, and divided what was left of the porridge. The children didn't know that the day's fire burned on wood someone else had left, or that the porridge was made from a little rice quietly placed on the step before dawn. But Maren knew. And that evening, when the others had gone to sleep early from weariness, she swept the patch of ground in front of the shed, gathered broken bits of wood and stacked them neatly. No one told her to, no one saw her do it. But for the first time, she wanted to leave something behind, even if it was just tidiness for the person who had given without asking. The next morning there was a small carving knife beside the water basin. Its wooden handle was smooth, fitting her palm. Not too big, not too sharp, just enough for a hand learning steady work. Maren picked it up, turned it over once, then set it down again, as if afraid to mark something she wasn't yet ready to claim. That night she used it to peel turnips, old, soft, wrinkled, but still enough to sweeten a pot of broth. She peeled in slow, clean circles, for the first time working not because she had to, but because she wanted to do it well. In the days that followed, Reuben didn't appear. No voice, no face. Only the things he left behind. A spool of red thread, a roll of coarse cloth enough to mend a torn collar, a sharpening stone set beside the washing tub. No note, no explanation. Maren didn't ask, but she used each one with care, like someone who knows the worth of what they've been given. She hemmed her sister's skirt, pricking her own fingers 3 times. She scraped the blackened bottom of the cookpot until a dull silver gleamed. She stacked the firewood in straight rows, binding each bundle with old twine, like in homes where someone truly kept order. No one asked her to, no one praised her, but the work was done, and it seemed someone somewhere was watching, not to judge, but to go on believing in her. Maren began rising before the sun, not to fight for her share, but because she had learned. When she tended things early, the children coughed less, the porridge burned less, the fire burned evenly, and the shed lost some of its damp smell. One afternoon, washing the handkerchief that had once been left for her, she saw its corner more frayed than before, not from neglect, but from being used enough to grow soft. She hung it beside the shed door, catching the wind just right, the way people who once had a home might do. For days, no words passed between them, but from one act to the next, something had begun to build, not with brick walls or fence rails, but with the rhythm of small, repeated tasks, steady enough to become a habit called belonging. And so each day, Reuben left something, never too much. And Maren used it, never asking for more. No one owed anyone, no one bound the other, but each did their part as if they had lived side by side longer than their years. One evening, Maren finished mending a shirt for one of the younger girls, placed it in her hands, and stood watching. The child smiled, hugging it to her chest, as if it were the first gift anyone had made for her. Maren said nothing, but in her eyes that moment there was no longer the look of someone merely trying to survive. It was the look of someone just beginning to know how to care, and not only to hold on. Part 7. The old name no longer matters. That day was hotter than usual. Dust swirled low around people's shins, so fine it clung to the air. Vendors at the market wrapped scarves tight around their necks and dabbed damp ash under their noses to breathe easier. Maren stood at the vegetable stall, holding a bunch of carrots still caked with earth. She wasn't planning to buy, just weighing whether she could trade it for 2 handfuls of beans. The woman behind the stall, an old shopkeeper with eyes neither sharp nor soft, looked at her and asked, almost absent-mindedly, "What's your name, girl? I need it for the ledger." That was all. An ordinary question, asked 100 times a day in Shelter's Hollow. But for Marin it was like a stone dropped into a bottomless well of memory. Her hand froze. Her eyes found no one. She set the carrots down slowly, turned, and walked away without answering. That night she sat alone beneath the tree behind the shed. The children were asleep. The firewood had burned to soft red ash. She looked at her hands, pricked by sewing needles, nicked by knives, splintered by wood grain. Hands that had cooked supper. Hands that had kept the fire. Hands that had carried 6 through cold nights. Yet still, hands not ready to shape a single name without feeling the bruise it carried. Marin had once had a name. It had been written in the church ledger, called out her first day at schools, and thrown down into the dirt the night her father drank. You bear your grandmother's name, but you're worth nothing like her. From then on, the name was no longer a name. It was a sentence, a blunt knife drawn whenever something nameless needed cutting, and she, since childhood, had learned to keep her mouth shut when anyone asked. She had tried once, years ago, at 10, sneaking porridge to a sick brother. She told a stranger her name, just to trade it for a lump of sugar. The woman laughed, a short, cutting sound. Pretty name. Strange your ma had time to give it to you. That remark sealed her silence for years. So when the stall-keeper asked, "What's your name?" Zrenya, it wasn't that she couldn't remember. She simply wouldn't let that name collect one more crack. The next morning, Reuben left a bundle of fresh straw behind the shed. No words. Marin saw it. She pulled it out, bound it with old twine, stacked it in its place, then covered it with burlap. Her hands moved evenly, without tremor. When Reuben turned to leave, he paused, not looking back, and said, voice low and steady as soil, "A name's not worth as much as the one who keeps the fire." Then he walked on. No waiting for her to answer, leaving only a long, quiet space behind him. The words didn't make her cry, didn't bring a nod or instant thanks. They simply stayed, like the warmth that lingers in your palms after stirring the coals, like the smell of a wool sweater someone once draped over you in the night, without speaking your name. From then on, people in town began calling her by other names. The skinny girl who keeps the fire, the sister of 6 at the shed, the one who makes porridge from old turnips. She didn't correct them, didn't claim them. Sometimes she gave a faint smile as if to say, "Call me what you want. Just don't throw the name I was beaten silent from." And then one night, when the youngest, lips still dry from fever, murmured, "Sister Marin," she only laid a finger to the child's forehead, smoothed her hair, and whispered, "Yeah, I'm here. No shame, no bracing for hurt. Just light enough for that name to find a new place. Not because it was given, but because she had lived to be worthy of keeping it." Part 8. Roots return. One dusk, as the sun balanced on the red hills, iron wheels rolled into town. The brittle clatter of a cracked axle made all the children in the shed look up. They thought it was a trader's wagon or a guest for the inn. Only Marin, hearing the dry, heavy scrape, stood still. That sound, unhurried, waited, was the same as the wagon of someone she once called Uncle. The wagon stopped right outside the shed. Dust cloaked the man stepping down. Hollow cheeks, dry lips, but the same familiar eyes, the kind that swept you from head to toe before deciding what you were worth. Beside him was a boy, maybe 15, Clothes wrinkled, eyes narrow, mouth curved in a half-smile. The man looked straight at Marin as though she'd never grown up. "Marin, isn't it? Still living here? I heard you've got some little ones. Blood ought to be with blood." The words sounded like an invitation, but the voice carried the cheap oil sheen of control. Thin, iridescent, tainted. Reuben appeared from behind, as if he'd known all along, not rushing, not planting himself in front of anyone, just standing in the evening wind, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat still damp on his shoulders. The look of a man who'd just finished hard work. He didn't speak first. He leaned his shovel against the fence, then asked simply, "And you are?" The man replied without pause, "I'm their uncle. Blood, got land that needs work. The kids will eat, work, live decent." The boy beside him snorted, "They live in this shed. Rough luck." Marin set a hand on the shoulder of the sister beside her, not tight, just enough so the girl knew. Not to fear. She stepped half a pace forward, not to shield anyone, not needing to, and for the first time in front of kin, she spoke, voice dry as dust. "If blood's all that matters, then where were you the winters before?" The question landed like a stone rolling into a canyon. Small, but the echo didn't fade. No one answered. After a moment, Reuben stepped closer. Not in front of Marin, not with a raised hand. He stood level with her, resting one hand on the fence, voice low. Not cold, but clear. "No one here is a sack of grain to be hauled off, and the one standing beside me is the one who's kept the fire 3 winters without needing a name." No one argued. No one laughed. The town had seen it. The skinny girl from before, now the one who stood against the wind and sun for her younger ones without needing to be told. The man shrugged, feigning indifference. "I just asked. We've got land, food, same blood." Reuben didn't bristle, only said, slow and measured, "Blood's a given, staying. That's something you choose every day." Then something small happened, unexpected. The youngest, Ivy, stepped out of the shed, hugging her worn stuffed bear, looked the man in the eye, and said softly, but with every word clear, "We're here with her." Just that. No tremor. No one spoke after that. The man snorted, waved the boy up onto the wagon. Iron wheels ground the road again. Dust rolled past the sinking sun. Marin watched them go. No anger, no bitterness, only the knowledge that her heart had no room left for the place that had once walked away. When the wind stilled, Reuben turned toward her, saying nothing. Marin didn't either. Only their eyes met. And in that look was an unspoken agreement that from now on, no one would be claimed back like a debt. Part 9. The wooden nameplate. That night, the town was as still as ever. Only the well frog's calls mingling with the small crackle of firewood in the stove. Marin washed the last of the spoons, dried her hands on the hem of her worn dress, then sat by the doorway. The young moon, thin as a silver fingernail, hung in the sky, not full, not bright, but enough to reveal the shapes that silence holds. Outside in the yard, Reuben was working a piece of old oak, the kind of rough plank usually used for marking cattle pens or patching worn fences. He sat on the step, rested the wood across his knees, and pulled the small knife from his belt. He didn't speak, just carefully shaved the surface smooth, as if preparing for something more serious than anything so far. After a while, he held the plank out toward Marin. "I usually use these to carve the cattle's names, but if you think it fits, carve yours here." Marin froze. No one had ever asked her that before. Even the ones who'd brought her into the world had only called her by habit or by whatever name came quickest to a scolding. A name, to her, had always come with punishment. It was the sound that tightened her shoulders and lowered her eyes. She had carried it like a stain that would never wash out. Whether Marin or anything else, it had been marked by the days she'd been abandoned, sold, treated like a thing. She looked at the plank in his hand. Rough, light, nothing special. But for the first time, it wasn't imposed. It didn't demand. It didn't insist she be anything. Reuben didn't press her. He simply set a carving knife beside it. If you think it's time, then try. Marin picked up the knife. The blade was worn, the wooden handle polished from years of hands. She drew the first line, slightly crooked, her hand trembling. M-R-E-N, no surname. No lineage, just a single name. Like the first breath of someone born again. She looked at the letters, then lifted her face, and for the first time didn't look away when her eyes met Reuben's. He nodded. Marin. Yeah, that's enough. The plank was hung on an old nail by the door, a hook that had once held a bridle, now bearing a small, neat name. That night Marin slept without dreams. No one shouted her name, no past chasing her down. Just deep, steady warmth, as if someone had finally nodded, saying she deserved a place inside a home. Part 10. The children called by their names. That same night, after carving her name, Marin sat long at the doorway. Moonlight spilled quietly over the cracked dirt yard, where 6 children slept close together like a small nest. Not one of them had been called by name through the long winter. They were the big one, the little one, the one who cries, the hungry one, the quiet one. Each label like a scrap of paper stuck on, easy to peel away without trace. And maybe that was why. None of them felt like they were truly real. The next morning, while Reuben went to cut wood, Marin spread a scrap of cloth on the floor. She called each sibling over. Not to sit straight, not to recite anything, just to ask gently, if I asked you honestly what you'd like to be called, what would it be? It doesn't have to be your old name. It doesn't have to match anyone's. The children hesitated. No one had ever asked them that. Names had always been something adults gave, for ease of scolding, calling, commanding. One girl, around 13, spoke in a low voice. I look up at the sky a lot. I'd like a bird's name. Birds fly far. Do you think that's okay? Marin nodded. She stitched onto the hem of the girl's dress. In a slanting hand, Skaya. A boy lifted his hand. His voice was timid. I like the sound of the creek, trickling when the dry season comes. It's happy, even when it's hot. Marin smiled faintly, sewing onto his shirt. Rill, water running soft between stones. And so it went. Each child, shyly offering the smallest thing they liked. One chose a name for the color of the sky, another for the tree behind the shed. Another didn't know, just said, "You pick something gentle for me." She didn't teach them to write just yet. She hand-stitched each name onto cloth and pinned it to their clothes using a different color thread for each, as if each child were a unique patch in the same quilt. That evening, Reuben came home to find the children sitting in a row on the porch, each one brushing their fingers over the name newly sewn on their shirt. No one boasted. No one called the others out loud, but their eyes seemed brighter. Marin stood in the kitchen corner saying nothing. She simply placed a few extra spoons on the table, and for the first time called softly, Skaya, help me with the greens. Rill, wash your hands, son. Reuben stood in the doorway. He didn't step in right away, just watched the way each child turned when they heard their name. Turned not because they'd been ordered, but because they'd been seen. In a land where too many were called by numbers, labels, or shouts, a gentle name was the first magic that told a person they were born to be different. Part 11. The Class Without a Blackboard. The next noon, as the sun slanted across the yard, Reuben propped a plank of scrap wood against the side of the house. The wind slipped through the roof's gaps, carrying the smell of old wood smoke, patched clothes, and the faint laughter of children still getting used to their new names. No one said anything, but Reuben opened the door to the old shed once used for hay and sick chickens, and began to clear it out. He set wooden crates together into a long table, swept down cobwebs with a broom of stiff grass, and laid burlap sacks across the floor. The space was small, with light only where it leaked through holes in the tin roof. But Maren understood. She found a piece of charcoal, sharpened it on a rock, then carefully wrote a first word on the board. Name. The first lesson had no bell, no straight-backed chairs, no books, only 6 children sitting cross-legged on the floor, knees bumping, their hands smelling of turnips and cornmeal. They held little sticks, practicing the first letters of their names in the dust. One frowned. Does it have to be written right? Maren answered softly, just write it so you remember that it's you. Word of the class spread in silence. No shouting, no invitations. But that afternoon, 2 more children came from the edge of the woods, hair tangled, eyes wary. They stopped at the doorway, afraid to step inside. Maren smiled and gestured toward the plank. This is where you write what you've never been called. They came forward, moving as if entering forbidden ground. One said, I've never been called anything. They just yell, Hey, you! Maren pointed gently at the board. Then we start from there. She wrote the word name again and placed the chalk in the child's hand. Each lesson after that was its own quiet journey. The children didn't learn multiplication tables or spelling rules. They learned to hold the stick steady while writing the first letter of their names. And when they read aloud, they learned to stand straight. Because to Maren, neat handwriting mattered far less than a child believing they were worth seeing and calling. Reuben watched from behind the door, never stepping in. Sometimes he nodded, then split more wood or stoked the fire. As if every letter written needed its own flame to keep warm, Maren began cutting scraps of cloth, writing each child's name on them and stringing them up like little flags in the dark shed, bright enough to move in the faint air. No one called it a school, but every child who left carried something close to self-respect. In a land where letters were often reserved for those with money and family ties, being able to write your name and believe it wasn't meaningless was a slow, steady step toward a life worth continuing. Part 12. A Storm No Longer Feared. The rains came late, but when they came, it was as if the sky emptied the remains of the old season onto the roof with a hard, relentless drumming. The wind didn't just slip through cracks, it clawed, it howled, like something forgotten returning to claim its place. Branches lashed the windows, the wind moaned like grief. In the wooden house at the edge of Shelter's Hollow, Reuben tended the fire as he always did. A pot sat on the stove, flames glowing orange beneath, the stew inside bubbling. Nothing unusual. Only tonight he added an extra potato, then glanced toward the window, where 6 small shadows huddled together. Maren wrapped another scarf around her sister. Her hands no longer shook. Once, such a storm would have been a nightmare. Rain had meant a leaking roof, bone-deep cold, clothes too damp to dry. It had meant nights curled up in an old stable, listening to younger ones cough in the dark, too afraid to ask for firewood. It had meant reaching out for warmth and finding only a cold wall and empty air. But tonight, the fire's steady crackle drowned out the rain, and more than that, no one was left outside the door. Reuben didn't ask questions, but he set a wooden cup before Maren. Inside it, an old silver spoon, the kind once used only for important guests. No words, but she understood. Beside the small schoolroom they'd built, a crooked nail stuck out of the wall. Reuben stepped over, carrying something small, a hand-carving pen he'd once used to make livestock nameplates. He handed it to Maren, nodding toward the wooden board in the class. "Your name belongs there." Not because she taught, not because he thought she needed to declare it, but because, in this house, everyone had the right to be present in their chosen name. Maren took the pen. For the first time her hand touched the wood, not to carve another's name, but her own. She looked at the space beneath the word name from the very first lesson and wrote carefully, "Maren Calloway." No one nodded. No one clapped. Only the stew began to send its sweet scent through the room. Outside, the wind still roared, but inside, the children's laughter slowly rose above it. Maren didn't know when she had stopped counting nights just to survive, and the rain no longer felt like an enemy. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Maren stayed by the fire a while longer. She picked up the chalk and wrote one more line beneath her name. "My name is not a gift from anyone. It's something I stayed to claim." Part 13. A day that needs no reason. The early spring wind drifted through the low grass, lifting away the last dust of the old season still clinging at the base of the well. New leaves whispered, not calling to anyone, not waiting for anything. But if you sat long enough on the old step, you'd see something was quietly growing in the silence. Reuben lit the fire earlier than usual, not because the air was cold, but because he was used to the sound of small feet running past the porch, and the youngest giggling when nearly tripping over the threshold. 6 children, each with a name, were chasing one another around the yard. Names for birds that fly far, names like the sound of a creek in the dry season, names for trees that grow on nameless slopes, names no one had given them, but now no one wanted to lose. Maren rinsed her hands in the cool water from the well. She no longer kept to someone's shadow. Her hair was tied back with the old handkerchief, her dress patched with thread she'd bought herself. She looked around, not waiting for anything, but her gaze held enough to fill a home. No one said, "We're a family." No one hung a sign that said, "Home." No one called themselves father, mother, or made anyone promise tomorrow. But at mealtimes, each person set a spoon for the one beside them. Reuben always placed the youngest's spoon on the left, because he knew the boy was left-handed. Maren always sliced the turnips softer for the third child, because she knew his teeth ached, and the eldest always set an extra scrap of cloth by her chair, for Maren to wipe her hands after cooking. One day, a passerby stopped for water. Seeing this, they asked Reuben, "You took them all in?" He only shrugged. "I didn't do anything big." Then he turned away, tossed more wood into the stove, as if to keep the fire warm for tomorrow. Maren looked at her shadow cast on the ground. She remembered the last time someone had held her hand. It was when she was being dragged from a doorway. This time, no one held her hand, but every step from the door to the yard, every task she did each day, was her choosing to stay. That noon, 6 spoons were set in their exact places, none out of order. The gentle clink of spoon against wooden plate was as steady as heartbeats. No song rose, nothing happened worth marking. But sometimes it's the days that need no reason, that people spend a lifetime missing. In the worn notebook Reuben kept, he scribbled a line. Not everyone needs saving, some just need to be allowed to stay. Part 14. What's carved in wood won't fade. On the porch hung a new sign. It wasn't polished, it wasn't painted fancy, just an old plank. Once part of a cattle pen, scrubbed clean, edges smoothed, strung up with a length of soft hemp rope. On it, Reuben had carved each letter by hand. House of small names. No blood, all heart. No one asked who wrote it. Marin didn't ask when he had started carving. But that morning, when she set a basket of turnips on the step and looked up at it, her chest warmed as if a fire was burning inside. Not a roaring blaze, just a quiet flame that would not go out. In that house no one shared blood, but they shared plenty else. Dry firewood on windy days, a spoon that kept a palm warm, a loaf of bread split without counting halves, the first laugh after seasons of silence. Marin now spoke her own name, no hesitation, no bowed head. She taught the children to read, to cook, to mend, but most of all, she listened. When one stammered about choosing a new name, she sat down, patient, without pushing. When another cried over missing their old name, she didn't correct or comfort with words. Just wiped their tears and waited until their breathing steadied. The little names they chose, stitched by hand, were sewn into hems, scarf corners, the insides of caps, not for show, not for decoration, but as a reminder, we're here in this world, and someone has called us by the right name at least once. At the end of the season, a traveler asked for a night's shelter. They read the words on the sign, paused a moment, then asked, "Is this an orphanage?" Reuben smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Number just a place, where you don't need someone waiting for you to be allowed to stay." That night, as wind slid under the roof, small names stirred in sleep, the names of children once left behind. The name of a woman who had once never spoken her own. The name of an old man who never claimed to be kind but had never turned his back on a cold child. All of them carved into an old plank. No ink, no seal. Once carved, they would not fade. The fire in the stove burned on. The smell of bread drifted onto the porch. Outside, dawn had yet to break, but in that small house on the dusty western plain, everyone was already awake, ready to live another day as if they belonged here. No need to prove it. No need to shout it. Just to know. Someone saw you and didn't turn away. There are people who step into our lives without asking where we've come from, without needing to know if we are right or wrong, worthy or not. They simply leave behind a loaf of bread, a scrap of cloth, or most quietly of all, they just don't turn away. In the dusty West, where folks often live by instinct and leave without reason, there are still hands that work in silence, still fires lit because someone chose to, not because anyone asked. And sometimes, like Marin, we don't need blood ties to belong somewhere. We only need to be called by our right name once, just once, to have someone stay.